Alright everyone, you may have seen that the US debt has now topped $20 trillion. Now, mostly this is a negative thing, so I'll be talking about it from that perspective. But first, there are a couple of things that people need to understand. First, there's still a lot of confusion over the difference between a deficit and a debt. People need to understand this. Like someone last night, they're saying, well, I thought Trump had reduced the debt. No, he reduced the deficit by reducing spending. Some discretionary spending that he reduced. The deficit is how much, in the case of the U.S. debt, year to year that you are at a loss for. That is the amount that you additionally owe on top of the debt that's there. If you have debt and zero deficit but also zero surplus, your debt is staying the same and you're simply making the interest payments and the amount's not moving. And if you don't make those payments, of course, that increases the debt too. We pay over $200 billion a year, I believe it is, just on interest on the debt. But debt itself is the total amount owed. So Trump hasn't reduced the debt. He's simply reduced the amount of deficit that we're in. We're still in the red. We're still losing money. We're still creating more debt at quite a quick pace. But the rate is slowed down. It slowed down for Obama's second term over time a bit. Trump dropped it more substantially when he got into office, but it's still there. We still have a deficit. Trump, by the way, has said, oh yeah, debt, who cares about that? I do oppose him on this. I think that's a problem. But there is one good thing to say here, and that's that most of that debt, unbeknownst to most people, is not held by China. It's not held by any foreign state. It's actually domestic. It's in the form of bonds and things of that nature. Essentially, people buy and trade U.S. debt because they know that they can make interest on it and actually increase the value that they can potentially get back. Like if you buy a bond, why do you think that bond over time is worth more money? It's because it's accruing interest on that bond. You have essentially lent the U.S. government money out of the productive market. Foreign states do this, individuals do this. Most of that debt, though, is domestic. It's held by the U.S. population and by U.S. businesses and investors, banks, things like that. It's not held by China. China, in fact, isn't even number one when it comes to foreign holders of U.S. debt. Japan is. I think Japan was at, 8% of all U.S. debt was held by Japan. I think China was a distant second at like 6%. So anyone who thinks, oh, well, we're so far in debt, we're controlled by China now, that's not the way it works. And also, how exactly are they going to recall the debt? There's no way for them really to do it. They can cash in a bunch of bonds or something, I guess, but that would just cause the government to print more funny money, throw it at the problem. This suggestion was openly made when Obama was president. They talked about minting a $1 trillion coin or two to reduce the debt. Well, you could theoretically do that. But the thing is, some debt isn't a problem. It's just we've got such a high amount of debt. And we're not the only country in this boat, by the way. China's got a huge amount of debt. Japan has a huge amount of debt. There are countries with a greater debt to GDP ratio. The absolute number matters less than the GDP to debt ratio. If you've got more GDP, you can have more debt, and it's still a smaller proportion of your economy. You can make the payments more easily. One of the big problems is we got involved in several very expensive wars and reduced taxes under Bush, and then the recession hits. That's really the driver of the debt. We had an economic downturn, a huge proportion of our economy flatlines. We have to throw several $1 trillion at various industries, taxpayer money at various industries in order to bail them out. People thought it was a good idea at the time. They're like, oh, well, we're going to go straight off a cliff if we don't bail out this bank. No, he wouldn't have. No, absolutely not. Somebody else would have come along and been perfectly fine at doing the same thing. Iceland did this. They just jailed the bankers. We probably should have jailed them too here. So debt is a problem. It's one that needs to be discussed. It was under Bush, like in his last months. People started talking about the debt in the last few years of W, because they're like, well, it's hit $3 trillion. We're getting nervous. Oh, now it's at $4 trillion. Oh, shit. The recession hits, the debt skyrockets, Obama comes in, he's like, oh, well, we need to throw money at the problem. Pump in more money, lower interest rates, do this, do that, and the other thing. And largely, it's just life support for the economy to keep up growth in hopes that the growth picks up enough to outpace the rate of spending. Well, that's beginning to happen. We've hit 3% now under Trump just because of consumer confidence. With tax restructuring, we can probably eliminate the entire deficit. We probably can, and in order to begin decreasing the debt. But it's going to be a long as fuck process. People need to realize that it's not, Rome wasn't built in a day. It's like people that think Trump should have something hammered out with the wall by now. It takes time. He's doing the best that he can. What more can he do other than at least try to tackle the issue? It's more than Obama ever did. It's more than W did. When W was confronted with a problem, he held a meeting with his dad and Dick Cheney and then buried his head in the sand and pretended it wasn't a problem. When Obama got into office, he said, I'm going to legislate via executive action, not work with Congress. I'm going to ignore them, browbeat them all day. Ultimately, we'll do nothing. Trump is at least trying. He's already reached across the aisle to work with Schumer and Pelosi, of all people. People that he obviously doesn't even personally like to any great extent. But he's willing to put on airs and give them a grin and shake their hand and say, hey, I'm Donald Trump. You want to work with me? Because the Republicans won't right now. He's trying. Give him time. He's not even a year into his first term, which will probably be the first of 2 terms, if I had to guess. And people are acting like he's supposed to have solved every problem under the sun by now. That's not realistic. It's simply not. Obama got hammered the same way. People expected him to fix the economy in like 6 months. Oh, get rid of the deficits, end the wars, close Gitmo. It takes more time than that. Yeah, he did drag his heels and end up not doing a lot of the stuff that he campaigned on. And that was a problem. But expecting him to accomplish everything in 6 months or less, my goodness, what are you talking about? Even with control of the House and Senate, it's hard enough. Trump has the same issue. Because a lot of people in the Senate especially won't work with him. He's got command of the House. They've fallen in line. Even Paul Ryan, who was an early holdout, he's willing to work with Trump now. Mitch McConnell less. I think the original goal was to restructure DACA and get wall funding in return for it by using Mitch McConnell to invoke the nuclear option. That's off the table at this point. But the debt's a problem, but it's not doomsday. It never has been doomsday. Our GDP, we do have growth. Our GDP continues to rise. It's just being outpaced by the deficit. What we need to do is cut spending massively, because there's a lot of dead weight on the government that makes the private marketplace less efficient. And yes, restructuring taxes so that corporations actually pay something and the small businesses and entrepreneurial classes and middle class stop getting hammered would stimulate the economy. Bush's idea of stimulate the economy was, hey, every American gets like a $300 check. Isn't it wonderful? It didn't stimulate anything. It didn't help. It didn't cause any substantial rise in growth because it didn't fix the overall problem with our tax system and with bloated bureaucratic government. Bush added to the bureaucracy. He wasn't people call him a conservative. Oh, this evil conservative starting wars. He wasn't a conservative. He grew the size of government substantially. He made all sorts of new bureaus, and he expanded those that existed and did all sorts of crazy things. He's not a conservative. He's a liberal. We'll see if Trump follows suit. My hope is that he doesn't. My hope is that he actually finally, once and for all, we can get someone who's at least a mild reformer on the tax issue. That alone would be a huge boon to our economy. Worrying about the debt is perfectly logical. Worrying specifically about the small portion of Chinese-held debt, or whatever it happens to be, that's not logical. Now, they have no leverage over us. They've got debt, too. Does that mean that countries that they owe money have leverage over Chinese policy? Nah, not really. It might give you a diplomatic seat at the table to discuss economic issues, but ultimately, it takes the form of the Chinese investing class wants to buy U.S. bonds. They want to buy into the U.S. They want to buy land here. They want to buy businesses here. They want stock here because they know that our economy is stable. It's finally a stable economy again after years and years of having problems. Later, second term Obama begins to stabilize and look better. It's looking even better now because consumer confidence is so much higher. Now, it could be that we have a couple bubbles burst and that everything goes to shit. Oh, it'd be total chaos because technically we're still pumping the economy to keep it alive. If we were to stop doing that, growth would slow down again. We need to restructure the tax code before we do that. But Obama never was willing to try. There's the problem. He just kicked the can. Trump is willing to attempt it. And I wish him well in doing so. If he does, but it's great for me, as a self-employed individual, within that sort of middle-class block, Be wonderful. We'll see what he manages to accomplish, and it looks like, once again, he pulled the switcheroo on the House Republicans. He's talking to the Democrats now on tax reform, too. What final deal gets hammered out? Who knows? Does it really matter? As long as something is done to try to reform the situation, at least there's an attempt going on. It could make it worse, yeah, that's absolutely true, but it could make it a lot better. Let's give it a chance and see what's hammered out, and hopefully it won't be like Obamacare. It won't be 1,000 pages of opaque legalese or anything like that. That would be too bad. You know, they tried that with the HCA. They tried that with McConnell Care and Ryan Care. And it didn't work. It didn't pass. You know, Ryan Care was so bad, it got immediately shelved and never even left the House. McConnell Care was so bad, it was like, oh yeah, we're like a million votes short. Nobody wants it. Public approval is swinging against us on this issue. Now they're backing off. They're not even trying anymore. They've moved on to other things like DACA, you know, North Korea. Things, by the way, that are more important. Repealing and replacing the ACA may be an issue for certain groups of people, but it's not one of the major issues Trump actually was elected on. Building the wall, reforming taxes, and being non-PC and or harder on our enemies around the world, those are the bigger issues. The ACA may have seemed gargantuan at the time. It clearly no longer is. And the national debt, I think, will re-enter the public debate. Like the media didn't want to talk about it under Obama. They didn't want to give updates to the U.S. debt, even though they knew it was wrong to hide that fact from the public, force them to go onto the debt clock site in order to see how much we owe. They didn't want to do any write-ups about it because Obama was president. They didn't want to piss him off because they knew that he'd be sour grapes. But they'll be willing to go after Trump on the issue. By the way, they should. They never should have given Obama a pass on the debt either, but it is not doomsday. The deficit is slowly shrinking. That's good news. But it's not the magic bullet to debt. We're talking about the difference between deficit and debt. They're not the same thing. That's about all. Peace out.